George Washington was elected to a second term without opposition, but his second term as president was marked by even greater partisan battles between the Federalists and the Republicans. And in this term, the issue that divided the parties was foreign policy. In 1792, France overthrew its king in a violent revolution, and France became a republic. And by 1793, France found itself at war with a powerful alliance of conservative monarchies led by Great Britain. Now, in this war, the Federalists, they sided with Great Britain, and at the same time, Republicans, they sympathized with and supported a fellow republic, France. Now, President Washington, he detested factionalism. He hated the fact that the country was divided, and he didn't really want to take side, supporting one side over the other. But eventually, he came to the conclusion by 1794 that it was in the nation's best interest to not side with Great Britain, but to patch up the relationship with Great Britain. And by doing so, that put Washington on the side of the Federalists. Now, what came out of this working out a deal with Great Britain was the Jay Treaty. And this Jay Treaty was hailed by the Federalists as a great achievement, but at the same time, Republicans and Jefferson denounced it. Now, the Jay Treaty did have the result of promoting peace and prosperity across the country, and this mainly benefited the Federalists. Remember, they were the ones who supported the treaty, and as a result, in the election of 1796, the Federalists swept into office. They gained control of Congress, and John Adams, who had served as vice president under Washington, John Adams defeated Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, a Federalist, became the second president of the United States. In this lesson, this period of the triumph of the Federalists, the age of federalism, we're going to look at, first of all, the impact of the French Revolution on American politics. Second of all, we're going to examine why Washington decided that he needed to resolve America's interests or differences with Great Britain and sign the Jay Treaty. And then we're going to look at the positive and negative reactions to this Jay Treaty. So let's begin with the French Revolution. Now, it would be this revolution that would really get the Federalists and the Republicans at odds with one another. In 1792, a political party, a radical political party known as the Jacobins, with broad support from the common people of Paris, they overthrew the French king, and France was declared a republic. In 1793, the king, former king, Louis XVI, he was put on trial, found guilty of treason, and he was executed by the new French Republic. This execution resulted in European powers, including Great Britain, who were all monarchies and very conservative. They formed a grand alliance to make war on France. And it was the general feeling in these more conservative countries that if they didn't do something to stop France, that these violent revolutions of the common people might spread to other parts of Europe. Now, when news of the French Revolution came to the United States, Republicans, they were very strongly supportive of France. They wanted that America should support a fellow sister republic. And across the country, in some 40 different communities, towns, and cities, Americans who were artisans and day laborers and farmers, they organized themselves into what were called democratic societies. They were inspired by what they saw the Jacobins doing in France. And some of these societies were called Jacobin societies. And these societies were determined to support the French cause, and some even took it to the point where they were raising money to provide resources for the French to create pirate ships to attack the British on the high seas. Now, the Federalists, they had a very different approach. Federalists, remember, they admired Great Britain, and Great Britain and America enjoyed a common cultural heritage, and many Federalists were supporters of commerce and trade, and Great Britain and the United States enjoyed very strong commercial relations. So Federalists were very much opposed to the French Republic. They denounced the Jacobins as dangerous radicals and demagogues. They believed that these Jacobins were fomenting mob rule and anarchy in France. One of the things they objected to about the Jacobins in France is that they had instituted universal male suffrage. In other words, all French males, even the landless and the people without property, could vote in the French Republic. And that was something that the Federalists found objectionable, because the Federalists believed that only people who owned property, people who had a stake in society, should be able to vote. So the Federalists were just bitterly opposed to the French Republic. Now, Washington, he had to deal with this situation where two men that he admired, Jefferson, who he was friends with and who was a fellow Virginian, and Hamilton, who he looked upon like almost a son. They were very close. Washington, had never really wanted to take a stand. He didn't want to support either side, one side over the other. But eventually he came to the conclusion that the United States needed to come to terms with Great Britain, that the United States and Great Britain needed to reach some kind of diplomatic agreement. So now what we have to ask ourselves, why did George Washington come to that decision? Well, first of all, in 1793 and 1794, what happened was that Great Britain began to attack American ships because, Americans were providing funds to the French, and so the British were attacking American ships on the high seas to retaliate for the fact that the French privateers or French pirates were attacking British ships. Another factor in Washington's decision was that he believed that it was very important for the British troops to withdraw from forts that they held along the Great Lakes region. You see, the British refused to withdraw from these forts along the Great Lakes because they believed that the United States had not fully come to terms with the agreement of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. So as long as the British felt that those terms were not being met, you had British forces, British troops in these forts, these key strategic forts. And these forts were being used by Canadian traders, Canadian businessmen, to supply Native American tribes with guns and supplies, and in return for furs and hides. Now this business relationship between the Canadians and the Native Americans, what it did is it allowed the Native American tribes to be very well armed. And they were using those arms to make constant attacks on American settlers who had settled in the Northwest Territory. This was the territory north of the Ohio River and south of the Great Lakes and to the west of the Appalachians. Now, in 1791, a confederation of Native American tribes had been formed, and they were led by the great Shawnee chief Blue Jacket. And this Confederate force of Indian tribes, they won a great victory over the United States forces under the command of Arthur St. Clair, who was at the time the governor of the Northwest Territory. At the Battle of the Wabash in Indiana in 1791, it was one of the worst defeats in American history. And the Americans were just crushed. Now, eventually what happened is that the United States organized a new force, and this time it was mostly Kentucky State Militia. And they were under the command of a man by the name of Anthony Wayne. And he was kind of a crazy guy and very unorthodox. He was called Mad Anthony Wayne. And with this force of Kentucky volunteers, he marched in north, and he met this Indian Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which was near Toledo, Ohio, in northern Ohio. And now the United States won this battle. They avenged their earlier defeat in the Battle of the Wabash. Now, it became clear from this campaign and from this battle that these Native American tribes were armed with British weapons, and even it was clear that Canadians were actually fighting alongside as militia, fighting alongside the Indian forces. Now, these military engagements made it clear to Washington that as long as the British controlled these forts, they would be in a position to continue to support these hostile Indian tribes and to provide them with weapons and supplies, and the settlers would always be at threat of attack. So now the problem was that these continual attacks by these hostile Indian tribes, Native American tribes, this was preventing westward expansion. And this was preventing Americans from moving into what is today Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, into the Northwest Territory. Now, it turned out that George Washington and many fellow Virginia planters had a vested interest in seeing that there be westward expansion. You see, back in 1785, back then the Continental Congress had passed the Ordinance of 1785. And this had created a system for selling federal land or land out west to individual private investors. It also, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had created a system that allowed for new states out west to be formed from all the settlers who moved out there. So what had happened is that Washington and many Virginia planters had invested heavily in land companies. These companies would raise money and then purchase land out west from the American government and then sell them to individual landholders for a profit. They were, in other words, they were like real estate companies who were promoting westward expansion. But these land companies were losing all kinds of money. In fact, many Virginia planters, like the father of Robert E. Lee, went bankrupt because they lost so much money on these land companies. So as long as you had the Indians making attacks on these settlers, there would never be a way for people to make money and to people to move out west. So George Washington and fellow Virginia planters had an economic interest in defeating these Indian tribes and allowing more Americans to move out west. Now, another reason why Washington came to believe that America needed to improve its ties with Great Britain was because he was becoming very, very concerned and worried about the French Revolution. In 1793 and into 1794, France was torn apart by what is known to historians as a reign of terror. It was at this time that the French Republic was basically ordering mass executions by the guillotine of all of its political opponents. And it was at this time that French radicals were attacking French Catholic churches and Christianity in general. Now, one reason for that was that back in the days of the French monarchy, the Roman Catholic Church was closely linked to the French monarchy. And so a lot of the opposition and hatred of the French monarchy was also directed against the Roman Catholic Church. So all these churches were being sacked and burned and turned into temples of reason. And that really bothered Washington. He didn't like violence. He didn't like mob action. He didn't like the anarchy. And he also was a person who attended church regularly. Historians debate the personal religion of Washington, but he did go to church on a regular basis. And he found it disturbing that the French radicals in France were attacking churches. So he became more and more alienated against Republicans here in the United States because they continued to support a French government that Washington found more and more objectionable. Now, in 1794, something happened in western Pennsylvania that really bothered Washington and fed his fears of the nefarious influence of the French Revolution. It's called the Whiskey Rebellion. What had happened was that in western Pennsylvania and across the West, the federal excise tax on whiskey was very, very unpopular. You see, in frontier areas, farmers out there, they didn't have a local market where they could sell their goods, their wheat or their livestock. So one of the few ways that if you lived in a frontier area, one of the few ways to make cash was to turn corn and wheat into whiskey. And then you could sell it that way. But now they were forced to pay this heavy tax on whiskey, and it was very, very resented by farmers out west. So in 1794, out in Pennsylvania, there were violent protests. You know, the government had arrested some tax evaders, and what happened is a mob was organized, and they broke free the people who had been arrested. Now, Washington, when he heard about these violent protests in western Pennsylvania, he was convinced that this was the result of the influence of the French Revolution, that he was opposed to anarchy, he was opposed to mob rule. So he actually went to Pennsylvania and took personal command of the state militia and marched on western Pennsylvania and restored order to the area. There was no, once the army arrived, there was no violence and the protest ended. But Washington was convinced that what was going on here was that America was being corrupted by the influence of these wild Jacobin peoples from France. Now, so you combine all these factors together, and Washington decided by 1794 that it was time to take action, that the United States needed to seek a diplomatic agreement with Great Britain. So in 1794, he asked veteran diplomat John Jay to go over to Great Britain. Now, John Jay was serving as Chief Justice. He was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was asked to take a leave of absence and go to Great Britain, and he negotiated a new treaty with Great Britain. Now, in this agreement, Great Britain said they would evacuate all forts from the Great Lakes. And that's the main thing that came out of this agreement. That's what Washington wanted. But it came at a price. First of all, the United States agreed not to seek any damages for all the British damage that had been done. All the ships that had been seized by the British, the Americans agreed to not seek any damages for all the property and ships that had been seized. Also, it was agreed that all the outstanding debts owed to British merchants that predated the Revolutionary War, all those debts were to be paid back. So a lot of especially planters in the South had borrowed a lot of money before the American Revolutionary War, had never honored those debts, and now under the terms of this treaty, those debts were to be collected. It was also agreed that Southern planters would not seek any compensation for all the slaves that had been freed by the British military during the American Revolutionary War. So those were the terms, and now the treaty was agreed to. It was then ratified by the Senate in 1795. Now, this treaty was very controversial, and Republicans denounced it as a betrayal of American interests. You know, Southern planters were especially outraged by this Jay Treaty because, remember, they were the ones who had to pay off their debts now. And they also didn't like the fact that they were not going to get any money back for all the slaves that had been lost during the American Revolutionary War. Thomas Jefferson, who didn't like Great Britain, remember, when he heard about the plan to send Jay, he resigned as Secretary of State because he was so opposed to it, and he became one of the biggest critics of George Washington. And there were vicious attacks against George Washington by Republican politicians and by newspapers across the country. In fact, George Washington was so upset by these negative attacks that he decided that he didn't want to have anything to do with running for a third term, and he really wanted to retire from public office. You know, he basically, when he retired after his end of his second term, he was very upset and very depressed because he was so much attacked by people who he thought were his friends, people like Thomas Jefferson. But the treaty, though, even though it was attacked by the Republicans, it did have some very positive results for the United States. First of all, the Native American tribes, they had been defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and now they found out that the British were withdrawing from all the forts along the Great Lakes. So basically, the Native Americans found themselves abandoned by people they thought were their allies. So the Confederation that had fought the United States up in the Northwest, in 1795, they signed the Treaty of Greenville. And they basically agreed to withdraw claims over much of what is today the state of Ohio. So basically, this treaty did open up these areas to settlement, and Americans began to pour into Ohio. In fact, Ohio would enter the Union as a new state in 1803, just some years later. Now, when Spain saw that the United States and Great Britain had formed an alliance, basically, had come to terms and signed the Jay Treaty, Spain did not want to be the odd man out. It didn't want to be isolated. So Spain contacted the United States and said that they wanted an agreement with the United States. So the United States and Spain negotiated a treaty. It's called the Treaty of San Lorenzo. It's also called the Pinckney Treaty. Thomas Pinckney was the American negotiator who was the person who negotiated this treaty with Spain. Now, in this treaty, Spain, first of all, agreed to recognize a new border between the United States and the Spanish province of West Florida that ran along the entire Gulf Coast. Also, as a part of this agreement, Spain reopened the port of New Orleans. Remember, that port had been closed since 1784. Now that port was open to American traffic. And this was a great deal for Americans trading. Because remember, the New Orleans was the main outlet for people out west to get to the outside world. Also, Spain evacuated Fort St. Ferdinand. This, actually, before it was Memphis, Tennessee, the Spanish had established this fort along the banks of the Mississippi to control traffic up and down the Mississippi. Now, by the terms of this treaty, Fort St. Fernando or St. Ferdinand was abandoned, and the Spanish withdrew. The Spanish also agreed to stop supplying arms to the Creek Nation. They were one of the more powerful nations, Native American nations, in that particular, in what is today the Southeast. And they had been actively opposing American expansion into what is today the states of Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. So the Creeks were basically abandoned by the Spanish. And what this did was to open up these areas to American settlement. It's not an accident, a coincidence, that the state of Tennessee joined the Union as the 16th state in 1796, just 2 years after, or 1 year after, the Treaty of San Lorenzo. That treaty opened up Tennessee to settlers on a scale never before seen. Now, another impact of this treaty was it really increased trade between the United States and Great Britain. Great Britain opened up ports in the Caribbean to American traffic. Also, Great Britain purchased a lot of American foodstuffs and timber for its navy and for its armies. Remember, Great Britain and France were at war with one another at the time. And so this trade with Great Britain really stimulated the American economy. So by 1796, the country was really doing well economically. And of course, the Federalists took all the credit for it. The Federalists believed that their approach had resulted in all this peace and prosperity. So it turns out that 1796 was an election year. And candidates who campaigned as Federalists, they won elections. And Federalists outnumbered Republicans in the Congress that was elected in 1796. Also in that year, since George Washington did not run, John Adams, the former vice president, he ran as the Federalist candidate. And he was opposed by Thomas Jefferson, who ran as the candidate for the Republican Party. And John Adams won the election and was elected as the first Federalist president in 1796. So this really was the age of federalism. Now, as we'll see, John Adams would have a very difficult presidency, and we're going to look at that presidency in our next lesson.